Hello, this is Duncan Barkes, host of A Nation of Taxpayers. Before we start this week's episode, the Taxpayers Alliance and myself would like to pay tribute to Patrick O'Flynn, whose death was announced on Tuesday. Paddy was a friend and supporter of the TPA, and I know I speak on behalf of John O'Connell, the TPA's chief executive, and all of the team when I say we are saddened by the news and send our love and condolences to Paddy's family, friends, past and current colleagues. His political insight was always first class, and throughout his time as political editor of the Daily Express, as an MEP and a political commentator, he always had his finger on the pulse of what mattered to hard-working, tax-paying Britons. On a recent episode of this podcast, he appeared as a guest and was as warm, humorous, shrewd and insightful as always. Paddy, you will be much missed. Thank you for all that you did.
Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
What is free speech and do we have it in the UK? Are certain views being muzzled more than other views? And what now for Lucy Connolly? These questions and more on this week's episode of A Nation of Taxpayers, the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. I'm your host, Duncan Barkes, joined by Will Yarwood from the Taxpayers Alliance. Hello, Will, once again.
Hello, Duncan. Good afternoon, mate.
And our guest is Toby Young, founder and director of this free speech union, or Baron Young of Acton, peer in the House of Lords, associate editor of the Spectator and creator of the Daily Skeptic blog. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. A lot of stuff to talk about here. We're recording this on a Tuesday afternoon in the heart of Westminster. We heard about the news this morning regarding Lucy Connolly losing the ability to appeal against her sentence. Where's your head currently with this afternoon, Toby?
Well, I'm very disappointed for Lucy, for her 12-year-old daughter, for her husband. She's also a carer to her husband who has a chronic disease. And she's now been in prison for more than 280 days. And her efforts to be let out on tag have been unsuccessful. Yeah. So I was hoping that the Court of Appeal might have, shown some mercy. Because to bang someone up her sentence was for more than 2.5 years for a single tweet that she deleted, in less than 4 hours and then apologised for. Yeah. And there were mitigating circumstances too. She said something, pretty nasty and intemperate about illegal immigrants. Yeah. She blamed the Southport murders on an asylum seeker, and she posted this tweet on the day of the Southport murders, and she felt triggered by those children being brutally killed because she herself had lost a 19-month-old son, and it was partly the fault of the NHS. So she, is processing her trauma about that, and this kind of brought it all back. And but she realised very quickly that what she'd said was not something she was willing to stand by. Yeah. I mean, people keep saying to me, as a free speech absolutist, would you defend what she said on free speech grounds? I mean, she doesn't even defend it herself. No. She apologised for it within less than 4 hours. The issue isn't whether, what she said was acceptable or unacceptable. It was clearly unacceptable. But should it have merited being sent to prison for more than 2.5 years? And I think, to put this in context, I did a bit of Googling and discovered that of the, 7 people in the Telford grooming gang sentenced in 2013, at least 3 of them, one of whom had pleaded guilty to controlling a child prostitute, another of paying for sex with a child prostitute, and even to call them child prostitutes is slightly misleading, as though it was a commercial transaction to which they consented. I mean, these were children. They got less than Lucy Connolly got. You know, how can it be right that someone gets, a more severe sentence for a single tweet, for a speech crime, however offensive the tweet is, than for raping a child.
And you can roll more into that. You can look at the fact that the MP who punched his constituent and pleaded guilty has served less time as a result of his behaviour. Hugh Edwards never went to prison for dodgy images on his phone, stuff that most normal people listening to this podcast would just go, hang on a second, he should do some time inside because of this. And yet you have a wife, a mother, I think it's fair to say, used the term triggered earlier, certainly of a fragile mind because of what she's been through in the past with her child, who is going to be serving 31 months in prison.
31 months.
It's ludicrous.
Yeah, it's actually depressing, to be honest with you. I was relatively optimistic for today's judgment. I'm not sure if I was right to be optimistic in that way, because I thought that, given how sort of screwed up our legal system is at the moment, I thought that, because of the mitigating circumstances, because of the great work the FSU had done on this issue, I thought that surely she would get, taken out and actually put back with her family who need her. Let's not make any two bones about that. But no, and you mentioned some cases there. I've got a few cases just in front of me. We've got a guy here who had 52 prior offences in assault on an ex-partner. He got a 9-month suspended sentence with no prison time. There's a guy here who had 75 prior offences and 19 court order breaches. He injured a victim so badly that the guy he injured was off for 12 weeks. He got a 1-year suspended sentence with no prison time. There's a guy here who had over 300 previous offences and guilty of 2 counts of theft. He got 42 weeks suspended sentence and no prison time, and 108 prior offences for this guy who stole a woman's bag and her car, and a judge told him he received no jail sentence at all. When people talk about two-tier justice in this country, I think actually they do have a big point, right? Because there are serious criminals, and we see it, every day in the news and even in our own lives, of shoplifting and assault and graffiti and just horrible things happening all around us, and they're not clamped down on. But when one traumatised woman makes a ill-considered tweet but recognises the problem immediately and deletes it, is thrown into prison for 2.5 years, makes you think, well, the point of freedom in this country is, right?
As a result of the current policy, we're letting people out of prison who have been convicted of violence and rape, and they're walking the streets to try and free up some prison cells. So, Toby, what's your take on what's actually going on here?
Well, I think there are two explanations for the recent clampdown on people saying intemperate things on social media, being arrested much more often than they have been in the past, being charged much more often, and in some cases convicted and sent to prison. And even if the police conclude no criminal offence has been committed, they'll record it as a non-crime hate incident.
Yes.
There's no question this is metastasising. So why is it happening? Well, I think there are two explanations. One charitable and one cynical. I think the charitable explanation is that this government and the prosecutorial authorities and the police, particularly chief constables, genuinely believe that inflammatory posts about asylum seekers and so forth on social media can cause social unrest. And the lens through which they viewed the disorder that broke out in some of our major cities last summer is not caused by roiling public anger about uncontrolled mass immigration, about our failure to control our borders, but caused by bad actors on social media trying to rile people up, intentionally trying to cause serious violence, provoke racial unrest. That's the charitable explanation. They genuinely believe that there is a causal relationship between people expressing their anger, venting about things like illegal immigrants, asylum seekers, undocumented arrivals from Muslim-majority countries. They think that directly leads to attacks on mosques, to women in hijabs being attacked on the street, etc. That's the charitable explanation. The less charitable explanation, the more cynical explanation, is that they see an opportunity to silence opponents. There are particular narratives, particular points of view that they intensely disapprove of, morally disapprove of and think are completely beyond the pale. And if you express those points of view, they think of you as a heretic who deserves to be punished. I think that the fact, as you say, Will, that there seems to be a real discrepancy between the way people who say left of centre things on social media, equally inflammatory, like the head of Hope Not Hate, who said that a Muslim woman had had acid thrown in her face by a white far right protester. The treatment of people like him compared to the treatment of Lucy Connolly suggests that it's if you come from one side of the political divide that you're being given this, you're having the book thrown at you. And that suggests the cynical explanation is more likely to be right than the more charitable one.
But it's wider than politics, isn't it? Because there was a story several weeks ago now about the two parents. It was in the Sunday Times, on the Times newspaper, who took to social media to criticise their child's school. And also there was a parents' WhatsApp group that if we've got kids at school, we're all being part of WhatsApp groups for parents, etc. And they got visited by the fuzz as well, and taken to task about some of the things because there'd been a complaint about the school. So that gets us beyond the political side, doesn't it? It gets us into that whole area where we seem to have this culture, particularly in certain police, I was going to use the term forces or police services, whatever you're supposed to call it these days, where anyone can start complaining about something you might have stuck on social media. You're going to get a knock at the door and there's going to be the fuzz, not one officer, but half a dozen, who are going to start coming in and asking questions about what you might be posting. Where does that overall climate, how has that been created?
It's, I think I think the police are deeply confused about what their role is now. And I think some people have persuaded chief constables, even police and crime commissioners, even Tory police and crime commissioners, that their job is not to investigate crimes, but to prevent crimes. To nip potential crimes in the bud, like the kind of pre-crime squad in Minority Report. And I think when they the reason they go round to people's houses when they've received a complaint, sometimes they claim that they're investigating a potential offence under the Malicious Communications Act or Section 127 of the Communications Act, or a public order offence, and they threaten people with arrest unless they come down to the station for an interview under caution, or they actually arrest them and drag them down to the station. But sometimes they actually go around to people's homes and say, there's been a complaint about something you've said in a social media forum, in a neighbourhood WhatsApp group, whatever it might be. And if it's a complaint from someone in an official or semi-official position, a headmistress or a chair of governors of a school, or a local councillor, or the partner of a local councillor, the police feel an obligation, I think, to go round to that person's house and warn them, fire a shot across their bows. And I think their rationale is before it escalates into something more serious. This was the rationale given by one of the witnesses for the College of Policing. The College of Policing came up with the concept of non-crime hate incidents. They did. A Tory-created quango, by the way. Came up with the concept of NCHIs in 2014 and essentially ordered police forces in England and Wales to always record hate crime reports which turned out not to be crimes as NCHIs, which is why I think more than 250,000 have been recorded over the past 10 years or so. And what part of the rationale for that, when Harry Miller sued the College of Policing, he originally sued the College of Policing and the police force that had recorded an NCHI against him, Humberside Police, and he won against Humberside Police but not against the College of Policing, so he appealed that verdict. And one of the witnesses for the College of Policing was a kind of big cheese at the college. And he submitted a statement, a witness statement in that case. And part of the rationale for recording NCHIs was, well, we know from the work of this American social psychologist called Gordon Allport, who interviewed a number of Holocaust survivors in the 1940s and 50s, that genocide always begins with the othering of a kind of minority, often in the form of jokes, disparaging remarks, treating them slightly unfairly, making them go to the back of the queue, that kind of thing. It begins with these tiny episodes, and then it escalates. And through his work has emerged this concept of the pyramid of hate, with kind of hurty words at the bottom and genocide at the top. And actually, if you look at Gordon Allport's work, he didn't say that unless you stamp this out, it will inevitably lead to genocide. He didn't say in every case where, a minority group is othered in this way, it leads to genocide. But he said often genocide begins that way. It's, what would you call it?
Snowball effect.
Yeah, it's one of the conditions, but it's not by itself a condition that inevitably leads to genocide. But I think the police took this seriously, misread it, and that's why they now feel they have this kind of weighty responsibility to intervene and reduce what they call community tensions.
Yes.
It's part of kind of, they think of it as their role to kind of diffuse the tensions in our multicultural society before they erupt into disorder or into hate crimes. And it's partly a legacy of the Macpherson report, and they don't want to be accused of neglecting hate crime reports, not taking them seriously enough, because, their worst fear is that a hate crime is committed. They were warned of it and did nothing to stop it. They fear that much more than they fear being accused of, clamping down on people's free speech or overreacting to hurty words on Twitter. It's part of, I think, lots of institutions in our society losing sight of their sense of purpose and having been kind of captured by ideological opportunists, for the most part, subscribers to radical progressive ideology. And it's not just the police, it's the health service, it's the civil service, virtually the whole of the public sector. Even lots of private companies seem to believe that their purpose now, their overarching purpose, what gives them their reason to get out of bed, it's not public service. It's about reducing injustice. And that often means standing up for beleaguered minorities, what they imagine are these victim groups, that their real role beyond what's in their job description. That's the kind of what gives them an overarching sense of meaning and purpose, protecting the most vulnerable, as defined by woke activists.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Toby. It's this weird symbiotic relationship between sort of an ideological, cultural mindset and then institutionalising and sort of engaging in lawfare to put that in place. And I'm so glad you mentioned the College of Policing, actually, because I actually wrote a piece in the Critic calling for, because Kemi recently said that if she got elected in 2029, she would abolish non-crime hate incidents. I said, great, but you need to abolish the College of Policing that institutionalised the damn thing in the first place, right? Because if you don't get rid of the quango, a Tory quango, like you said, that actually caused that in the first place, then you're actually not going to deal with the root problem at heart. And you mentioned the Communications Act there. Why on earth, with 14 years of Conservative government, was that act not repealed when it was clear what that act was supposed to do, which has now caused all these problems down the line, has been used for various nefarious purposes, including during COVID, by the way, when people had knocks on the door for their opinions on COVID lockdowns and vaccines and whatever the like might be. It's about dismantling the legal architecture involved in it and having the courage as a politician to stand up and say, I don't care about your mindset and your desire to protect those who you perceive to be on the bottom level of the hierarchy, if you will. No, this is completely anti-illiberal and totalitarian and is causing so much hurt and so much trouble in our society that it needs to go. But from what I've seen, Toby, virtually very few politicians on either side of the aisle are willing to talk about the legal architecture, how to dismantle it, and make sure that these people never get control again.
Let's talk about this in a bit more detail. Obviously, you set up the Free Speech Union. What the hell can we do about this? Because, I think there'll be a groundswell of opinion, particularly people who listen to this podcast, that you used the term actually depressing. It is depressing. We find ourselves in this place. What can we do about it?
Well, you can join the Free Speech Union, www.freespeechunion.org.
Proud member.
Cheap as chips.
Yep.
And boy, it'll be the best money you ever spend if you ever get into trouble. We are campaigning on various fronts. I'm about to actually go to the launch of our campaign against the banter ban in a pub around the corner this afternoon. Do you want
to just explain what the banter ban is, just in case there's some people listening?
So Clause 20 of the Employment Rights Bill will make employers liable for the harassment of their employees by third parties, i.e. customers, members of the public. And we're not talking about sexual harassment by third parties. That's already unlawful under the Worker Protection Act. We're talking about non-sexual third-party harassment. And if you look at how harassment has been defined in successive cases that have been brought before the Employment Tribunal, it does include banter. It includes overheard conversations that the person overhearing might find upsetting or offensive by virtue of their protected characteristics. In fact, they don't even need to have the protected characteristic in question themselves. They can take offence on behalf of a colleague.
Someone else.
I've proposed various amendments to Clause 20 and made the argument for those amendments in the House of Lords yesterday. And actually, the response by the government, who are being pretty intransigent about this, as you can imagine, was quite revealing. They essentially accused those who wanted to dilute the authoritarian impact of the banter ban, which will mean, in hospitality venues like pubs, bars, restaurants, it'll mean that conversations will have to be policed. And if there's a risk that something you say might offend, a particularly sensitive member of staff, you'll be barred.
So let's give an example. So, very recently, you've got a couple of people having a beer in a pub. There's a conversation going on about the recent announcement regarding further cozying up with the EU, for example. You've got a couple of, let's say they're blokes, having a beer, just going, I think it's disgusting what's happened. The person who works in hospitality, the other side of the bar, who may be a 110% Europhile, gets a little bit upset about this. Then that comes into play, right? They can complain to their boss and say, I should not be exposed to this.
Yes, and under this new clause, employers will be expected to take all reasonable steps to protect their employees from being harassed, from overhearing conversations. It doesn't just apply to bars, restaurants, pubs. It also applies to sports venues. So, the example I like to give is, let's take a topical example. For those of us who watched the FA Cup final last week, let's suppose someone in the stand shouts at the referee, "Are you blind?" because he fails to give a goalkeeper a red card for handling the ball outside the 12-yard box. If a partially sighted steward overhears that expostulation, he or she could sue the club for not taking all reasonable steps to protect him or her from being harassed in that way by virtue of his or her protected characteristics. The only, logical outcome of the banter ban in football stadiums will be that every stadium in the country has to become a library. It won't just be Keir Starmer's beloved Arsenal that becomes a library if this goes through unamended. But the other side, the government defenders of the clause were essentially accusing those, raising the alarm about it, of being pro-harassment. How can you think it's okay for poor, beleaguered minority workers to be abused, screamed at, racially abused, suffer transphobic and homophobic abuse, misogynistic abuse.
It's straight out of the left playbook, isn't it? The fact that you might challenge something automatically gets branded as, well, how can you possibly justify people being attacked in this way? And it shuts down the debate, right?
And I think that's one of the reasons the Tories didn't repeal Section 127 of the Communications Act or the Malicious Communications Act. They didn't want to have to deal with that accusation of not caring about the most vulnerable members of our society. But one counter argument to this is that if you look at the evidence the government produced ahead of rolling out this bill, that non-sexual third-party harassment is a real problem in the workplace that needs to be dealt with by legislators. They produced this survey, but if you drill down into the survey, what it reveals is that the number of workers who complained of non-sexual third-party harassment in the workplace in the last year is 0.51%. That's the problem that they're using this sledgehammer to solve. And, lots of the people on the government benches said yesterday, what are you objecting to? The Rubicon's already been crossed. We see posters on the tube all the time saying customers do not harass TfL staff. You see those posters in banks, in restaurants. Why are you objecting to asking people to behave in a more courteous manner towards the people serving them, trying to help them, etc.? The counter-argument is, well, if only 0.51% of the working population have recorded instances of non-sexual third-party harassment in the last year, then asking people to voluntarily behave in a courteous way towards service personnel is working. You don't need to legislate to force people to behave in that way.
It needs to be zero.
I mean,
right?
it needs to be. It's kind of. There should be a personality disorder which kind of captures this legislative mania, this belief on the part of the government. I mean, boy, are they legislating a lot.
Legislatitis,
legislative,
personality disorder,
legislative derangement syndrome. I mean, but they want to legislate about every aspect of our society, including how people behave in pubs after they had a few drinks. They say.
I think it is depressing. I think it's disturbing. Will, just a final thought on this before we lob a couple more questions at Toby.
Sure. I think there's also an issue here sort of inculcated in the British people, is that I think this mindset has sort of gone into them as well, where there is and you saw it during COVID a little bit. I'm mentioning COVID a lot, but that's when I was kind of radicalised on this stuff. The sort of curtain twitching, right? The reporting on people and naming names and telling people and sharing things around. Some people in our society get quite a kick out of that and enjoy it because they feel like they're being very law-abiding citizens and they're, above whatever that, idiot is doing and are not abiding by certain rules and not doing what, government legislation says so. So in a way, in modern Britain now, you wouldn't need a secret police because a lot of modern British people would just report you to the state anyway for saying a thing they disagreed with. I mean, the banter ban is insane personally, because when I used to work in a pub at university, I mean, some of the stuff you heard in there was crazy, but it's drunk blokes talking over football. It's not a big deal. It doesn't matter. And obviously I was never personally offended by any of it because, why would I be? And, obviously if people were physically assaulted, which they never were, obviously that would have been dealt with. But the idea that we have to have essentially a Stasi inside our pubs, which, do they want to kill the pub? Oh, maybe they do want to kill the pub industry, but, you're destroying one of the last vestiges and the last little areas of freedom of speech which we do have, which is pubs, where people can sit down and talk a load of serious stuff or just talk a lot of nonsense. And this government says, actually, the problem is young people, whoever it is, going to pubs and saying inappropriate things, so therefore we need to institute a law to make sure that they don't say these things because someone in the future might potentially get offended, but we can't know that. It's just, you're right, the desire to legislate for everything and everyone is part of what's sick about this country, and the more it's like how a dying society accumulates laws the same way a dying man accumulates diseases, basically. Right.
And boy, you get a window onto this in the House of Lords. I mean, there are always two or three even more bills going through the House simultaneously because the government is trying to cram so much in. I mean, I think they've calculated, perhaps not inaccurately, that there'll be a one-term government, and they've waited 14 years in frustration on the opposition benches, thinking about what they'd like to do when they get into office. So they've got they've got vast reams of legislation that they want to kind of railroad through in their kind of short period in office. I mean, it's absolutely overwhelming and quite hard to kind of properly scrutinise.
How are you finding the House of Lords?
I'm finding it fascinating and sort of gradually getting stuck in. I mean, it's there are so many rules. I mean, I got into trouble yesterday. I opened for the group that my amendments to Clause 20 were in, and you have 15 minutes to speak about your amendments when you open a group, and then you also have to wind up. And on paper, you have 15 minutes in which to wind up. I mean, I checked beforehand, and it said you have 15 minutes to wind up. I was 12 minutes into my wind-up when I was clearly winding up the opposition because, or rather the government, because one of the government whips got up and said, Mr. Young, Lord Young. Oh no, he said he can't direct people to do. How long is the noble lord going to speak for? We all want to go to supper. We've been here for hours. I was under the impression I had 15 minutes. Oh, come on! Oh, and it was, but clearly that was a mistake. And the convention, I think, is yes, technically on paper you have 15 minutes, but if you're winding up, don't take longer than 5. Yeah. And I'm constantly tripping up over those unwritten rules. And here's another good one. I mean, the written rules are voluminous. Right. I mean, on your first few days, you kind of stagger out out of there, virtually unable to see over the top of the kind of books of rules you're carrying in your arms. But the unwritten rules are even more voluminous. So I remember bumping into Dan Hannon, and great to see him, thrust out my hand, and he gave my hand a withering look and said, "We don't do that here." I was like, who knew? That's not in the rule book, but apparently it's one of the unwritten rules. But gradually learning the ropes and understanding how to at least attempt to amend legislation, and it's frustrating because in opposition it takes a long time. You have to have a lot of patience to actually achieve anything. Sometimes you can, but it's pretty rare.
What would you change about it? Based on what you've experienced so far in the House of Lords, what do we need to change?
I think it's probably a little early for me to suggest reforms. I mean, one thing I'd change is I'd keep the hereditaries.
Of course.
The hereditary peers bill has been railroaded through, and it looks like the hereditaries will be gone by July. And they were kind of, pleading with the government to make at least some of them, give at least some of them life peerages. Right. Many of them are extremely valuable members of the House. They chair committees, they contribute to debates. Some of them are ministers, some of them are shadow ministers. And generally, they have a lot of expertise and dedication. Much more impressive than many of, the numerous peers nominated by successive prime ministers for not terribly respectable reasons. Seeing them go, I think, is a real shame. So one thing I'd do, I think, having met quite a few of them and seen them at work and seen the work they do and the contribution they make, is I would keep them.
Toby, it's been great. Thank you. Will, thank you as well. I think the bottom line here, the main takeaway is anyone listening to this podcast who cares about freedom of speech, join the Free Speech Union. I don't think there'll be any disagreement. Toby,
Indeed.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Will, thank you as well. And thank you for listening. Just a reminder, there's a massive archive of various episodes of this podcast that you can find on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our YouTube channel. Loads of fascinating chats with various people, including former Margaret Thatcher advisor John Redwood, MPs Esther McVeigh, Rupert Lowe, a ton of stuff. Go and have a look. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'd like you to do that. And also you can follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And anything you want to send us, any suggestions for future guests or any comments, do send us an email. It's podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.